Okay, so you are looking at my 5-year-old Yobo FC Twin clone console. It's got Dr. Mario in it, which is an NES game, and this thing is capable of playing both NES games and Super NES games and uses Super Nintendo controllers. That's a Super Nintendo controller for those who don't know. Anyways, this is a clone console that I bought back in October of 2007. So it's 5 years old and it still works. So, there's people that usually question the longevity of clone consoles, how, they're cheap and stuff. And I've heard some horror stories about how some people tend to buy these things and they don't last a month or even a couple days. They sort of break down. I was fortunate because this thing lasted 5 years and it still works. But we're not here to talk about the FC Twin, we're here to talk about this thing. Alien 3 for the Super Nintendo.
Alien 3 for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System is an attempt by Probe to try and offer a different kind of video game, the end result being a game that is either highly regarded by some gamers or lesser regarded by others. It is by no means a bad game, despite the 1-2 punch of bearing the Rainbow of Death on the cover and the maligned Acclaim logo in-game. The one thing Alien 3 does not do is offer a putrid experience of a video game, so rest easy, Alien 3, the video game at least, does not suck. So the only question remains is, how good is the game, really? At first glance, Alien 3 appears to be your standard run-of-the-mill side-scrolling action platformer, putting you in control of series protagonist Lieutenant Ellen Ripley, and charging you with the task of eliminating the aliens infesting the Fiorina Fury 161 penal colony. From the offset, you have 3 weapons at your disposal: the pulse rifle, grenade launcher, and flamethrower, each with various uses and advantages, but all possessing limited ammunition that you'll have to reload every so often. In any case, conservation of ammo is key to survival in Alien 3, and something you have to keep in mind when carrying out your mission objectives. Okay, so here's where the different kind of game comes into play. Alien 3 features 6 levels of play, and each level is a series of interconnected areas that you can navigate and explore at your discretion. In each of the 6 levels, you have a number of mission objectives that you could pick out and accomplish. Some of these are basic rescue missions, recovery missions, extermination missions, containment missions, that sort of thing. You just have to rescue some prisoners, stuff like that. Basically, you pick out a mission objective from a terminal, survey the map to figure out where to go and what to do, carry out your objective, and return to the terminal to pick out another mission. Once all missions in the levels are successfully completed, you move on to the next level and repeat the cycle all over again, only in a new set of levels with more dangerous aliens waiting in the mists. Alien 3 is certainly an ambitious direction on the part of Probe. The decision to go for task play in a free-roaming world divided into a number of areas gives the game a unique quality that seldom developers tend to go with licensed games back in the day. Not to mention that it initially looks to be executed rather well. Accessing a terminal to review your mission goals or oversee the map at the current level is something that helps tremendously with giving the game that extra bit of depth and care. And the motion tracking system to search targets is a nice added touch even if I don't personally use it myself. Playing through the first level alone gives you that sense that Alien 3 wasn't going to be your usual run-and-gun platforming rubbish. It was going to be something different, and offer a game that far exceeded your expectations in regards to a licensed title published by Acclaim or LJN, or what does it matter, they're both the same company by this point anyways. Control in Alien 3 is fairly decent for the most part, pretty responsive. All 3 of your weapons are mapped to each of the 3 face buttons that isn't a jump button, and this works surprisingly well. I was almost afraid at first that such a setup would feel a bit cumbersome, but that's certainly not the case here. You could use all of your weapons with relative ease, and it doesn't feel like a chore, so in that regard, I can't really complain all that much. You could also duck and crawl, which is a necessity to pick off smaller foes, such as facehuggers, chestbursters, and the alien eggs. I have no real issue with the controls in general, they work just about fine. There are a couple minor quibbles with Alien 3, however, one being jumping. Mind you, you can control your jump in mid-air and that's fine. While jumping feels a bit floaty for my tastes, at the very least it works fine. There's never a point where you would overjump or underjump a pit, unless the pit is naturally very big and would require alternate means such as a flying platform or climbing hanging ladders. No, my issue is that Ripley can't jump straight up. Pressing the B button alone will cause Ripley to jump about an inch forward in the direction she's facing. I have to question the logic behind this since it doesn't make much sense. If you wanted to jump a bit forward, you jump straight up and tap in the direction you want to inch towards. I guess they wanted to eliminate that extra step, but I'd rather have that extra step, that extra choice, than have it forced upon me. It's a minor quibble, but one I felt I wanted to bring up. The other thing is that Alien 3 tends to drag a bit. It took me a while to beat the first level, clearing all the mission objectives and whatnots. That's fine, no real big issue with that. Second level took a little longer to beat, but I got to it. But it gets to a point where the levels start to resemble each other, and the whole process becomes a bit tedious. Despite the more complex level layouts and more challenging alien forms, you're still pretty much doing the same mission types and performing the same tasks, only in a new setting of increased challenge. It didn't take long before I eventually got bored playing the game after a couple hours and turned it off. It ended up being a game that, in my case at least, is best played in moderation. Which leads me to my other minor quibble. Alien 3 is a game that would have greatly benefited from a save function, battery backup. Yes, there are passwords that can take you to later levels, but you only get these levels after clearing all the mission objectives in a level, and they're the only means of continuing. So if you're halfway through a mission checklist and you somehow croak, all that work goes out the window. You type in your little password, you have to do all the missions all over again. That can be quite a frustrating affair in a game that requires quite a bit of time on your part to complete, and each level alone takes a significant amount of time to complete given the navigation and slow pacing of the game. A save function that keeps track of your completed objectives and available ammo might have been a beneficial addition to the package without affecting the overall challenge level, which is pretty tolerable in its own right and even comes in 3 difficulty settings. In terms of presentation, Alien 3 looks absolutely gorgeous. In terms of recreating the dark, moody atmosphere of the Alien films, Probe nailed it with the visuals, as the overall environment has this morbid sense of dread that is evident throughout the game. I like the alien corridors with the mist and the fact that it doesn't take up the whole screen, it's sort of like a widescreen type of thing. I like that effect. It's a shame there isn't enough alien corridors in the game, as the rest of the game's levels comprise very plain looking prisons, waste areas, and furnaces among other things. Even so, it all looks particularly dreadful in the right way. Ripley herself animates rather nicely when she moves about. While the aliens look fine, they look menacing, they don't animate as fluidly as Ripley does, but no big loss I suppose, they're easily disposed of anyways, so. The only real gripe I have in terms of graphics, like I said before, is that the levels look too similar to each other. Yeah, it's a penal colony and all that, but that doesn't mean you can't introduce subtle differences here and there, whether it be different lighting or slightly different color. It would have given it a little more flavor. I don't know, it's just me, but what the game does is superbly done, so, and no hard knocks, I suppose. Likewise, Alien 3's soundtrack is equally moody. There's no happy, cheery, upbeat music to be found here. Everything is dreary sounding, tension-filled, and foreboding in terms of soundtrack. And it fits the game rather well. Of course, there's only a handful of tracks, and a different tune plays each time you take on a new mission objective. On the other side of the coin, the alien screeches and gunfire effects sound pretty good for the most part. Sound-wise, no real complaints. Alien 3 is a bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, I could sort of appreciate the free-roaming, mission-based gameplay, and the overall attempt to try to make the game more than a simple side-scrolling action game. Not to mention that the dark atmosphere of the Alien films is properly conveyed in terms of visuals, sound, and overall presentation. On the other hand, the missions themselves tend to be pretty repetitive at times. Various levels do end up looking similar to each other. The slow pacing causes the game to drag on for far longer than necessary. The constant need to crouch in order to pick off numerous facehuggers and alien eggs does take the game down a couple notches. Ultimately, this is a pretty above average game that looks top notch, but just doesn't play as well as most would have you believe. It's not necessarily a bad thing because the game does have its moments, and if you could get around the tedious nature of the gameplay or decide to play this in moderation like I do now, there's quite a bit of fun to be had here. It's actually worth checking out if you're into the Alien movies or just want something different from the norm. It's also pretty cheap as well, so you're not losing out on much if you can't get into it. Overall, Alien 3 is a pretty decent offering with promise of something bigger, but falls just short of achieving greatness.